Hi, and thank you so much for popping by. My name is Dr. Bilateral, and you're most welcome to this conversation today. In the next couple of clips, in the next couple of days, in the next couple of weeks, I will specifically be talking about HIV. And that's because World AIDS Day is around the corner. World AIDS Day ends on the 1st of December every year. And I will likely continue the HIV conversations into the month of December. And just to remind you that when we talk about HIV, we're talking about not just the disease in isolation. We're talking about the social determinants of health. We're talking about the factors that make our communities unhealthy. And that is why you will find, as you start to listen to the HIV story carefully, you will find that we talk about issues of employment. We talk about youth unemployment. We talk about gender inequality. We talk about gender-based violence. We talk about all of these factors because these are the factors that perpetuate and make certain populations very vulnerable to HIV, right? These are the factors that make communities vulnerable to HIV infections, to new HIV infections. This first clip, I'm going to focus my attention on HIV funding, on global HIV funding, right? I'm going to share a few facts about global HIV funding. So this is not a secret. The United States is the largest donor to HIV in the whole world. It is the United States. The United States accounts for 80% of total donor government support globally, right? It accounts for 80% of donor government support. So when the United States decided or is considering to rescind its HIV funding, we are talking about a very large gap that is going to need to be filled, right? So in this case, according to data, the United States is considering to rescind almost 40% of HIV funding by 2026. So that's a fact. Another fact that has to do with global HIV funding is that there are other large donors to HIV, and these are all in the developed and first world nations, right? So we're talking about the United Kingdom, we're talking about Germany, and we're talking about France. And specifically, France is the second largest donor. It contributes 4% to global HIV funding, which is the equivalent of 314 million US dollars, right? And then Germany, in this case, contributes to the global HIV fund 226 million US dollars, which is 3%, right? And the UK is 218 million, right, which is 3%. And then the Netherlands contribute 192 million US dollars to the global HIV funding, and it is 2% that it accounts for. Those are the facts, right? And then some of the facts when we talk about global HIV funding and why there is so much pressure in the developing world to fill this HIV gap is that when we combine the bilateral and multilateral support from these global HIV donors, it's an accumulative 8.37 billion US dollars. So in 2024, these countries, these large donor countries to HIV contributed 8.37 billion US dollars in 2024. So you can imagine the gap. You can imagine the gap when we hear the stories about countries rescinding or reducing that donorship, right? And in the case of the Global Fund, they received majority of this HIV-related funding from the 8 donor governments, right? And in the case of Global Fund, they received 2.27 billion, or 91% of the total funding from the various donor governments, right? So the Global Fund had 2.27 billion US dollars, which is accounting for 91% of the total global HIV funding. And UNAIDS received 169 million, or 7% of the global HIV funding, and this is in US dollars. And UNITAID also received 2%, which is 59 million US dollars, right? So this is in the year 2024, just for the period 2024, right? So essentially, the first world nations are the ones that are providing the funding to the low to middle income countries. And specifically, when we talk about the US being the largest donor government, it has been providing funding for HIV through PEPFAR. So if you look at this concept of global HIV funding, it's basically the first world nations giving support to the low to middle income or developing nations, right? And this is essentially the first world nations saying, we're doing our social responsibility, right? The first world nations are basically doing a form of social responsibility by providing donorship to the low to middle income countries. And this has been going on since the advent of HIV. So in the next clip, I'm going to go beyond the facts about this bilateral and multilateral funding, and I will now be looking at exactly where this funding goes to, right? Which countries are receiving these funds, and I'm specifically going to be focused on the sub-Saharan African region and the East African region included. Alrighty, my friend, I thank you so much for popping by. I hope you are having a lovely day where you are, but most importantly, I hope you're having a healthy day wherever you're watching me from. Bye.